listening to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them and leave us a review. In the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest military invasion in recorded history. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, it was a full-scale assault on the Soviet Union across a front stretching over 2,000 miles. Hitler's strategic goal was clear: destroy the Soviet state, capture its industrial heartlands, and seize control of the oil fields that fueled its war machine. The invasion was divided into three massive army groups. One drove toward Leningrad, another toward Moscow, and the third, Army Group South, pushed deep into Ukraine and toward the oil-rich Caucasus, where control of the Black Sea became essential. This campaign was not simply about territory, it was about annihilation. Nazi ideology viewed the East as a space to be conquered, and its people to be subjugated or destroyed. What followed was a campaign marked by extremes, extreme violence, extreme resistance, and extreme demands placed on both soldiers and civilians. It was on the southern front, on the edge of the Black Sea, that one position became critical, not just as a port, but as a strategic anchor. Its capture would strip the Soviets of their naval presence in the south. Its defense would delay the German timetable, drain German strength, and force decisions that rippled across the entire Eastern Front. The consequences of what happened there shaped the war's trajectory. Because of what it cost the Germans to take it, and what it took from them to hold it, subsequent operations in the Caucasus were weakened. Key units were tied down for months when they were needed elsewhere. When the Red Army regained the initiative, the German defenses in the south were too brittle to hold. The Soviet advance, once it began in earnest, pushed past that point, and it never stopped. What took place on those cliffs and harbors did not decide the war on its own, but it was one of the places where the war began to decide itself, and its effects are still visible in the borders, the alliances, and the geopolitics of the world today. Let's now experience the Siege of Sevastopol.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 41, The Siege of Sevastopol, from the 30th of October, 1941, to the 3rd of July, 1942. Nazi forces, 204,000 soldiers, 670 heavy guns, 655 anti-tank guns, 720 mortars, 450 tanks, and 600 aircraft. Soviet forces, 106,000 soldiers, 600 heavy guns, 100 plus mortars, 38 tanks, and 55 aircraft. The battle for Sevastopol and the wider fight for Crimea siphoned off critical German divisions from the southern push toward the Caucasus, delaying the drive for oil and momentum. At the same time, it gutted Soviet naval power in the Black Sea, silencing it for nearly 2 years and leaving the coastline exposed and vulnerable.
When the Nazis kicked down the door to the Soviet Union in June of 1941, they didn't come swinging wildly. Now, this was a precision strike split three ways. Army Group North was gunning for Leningrad. The center had its crosshairs set on Moscow, and to the south, the hammer came down hardest. Army Group South was charging full force toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Fuel, power, the very blood of war. As the German war machine rolled south toward the Black Sea, one name started echoing through command rooms and war councils: Sevastopol. Anchored in the rocky heart of the Crimean Peninsula, it wasn't just a port, it was the Soviet Union's naval spine in the south, and the Germans wanted it broken. If the Germans took Sevastopol, the Soviets would be choked off from their only warm water lifeline. No more resupply, no more fleet, no more Black Sea defense. This was the jugular. By the fall of 1941, the Germans had swept the Crimean Peninsula clean of most Soviet resistance. It wasn't subtle. It was brutal, fast, and it was calculated. They weren't just moving in, they were carving their path in steel and in blood. The man given the job of finishing it was Erich von Manstein, commander of the 11th Army, sharp mind, cold resolve. His orders: take Crimea, break Sevastopol, and hold it until the map bled. The first German blow came down on the 30th of October and dragged through to the 21st of November, but they hit a wall, 3 layers thick, Soviet-built and manned by soldiers who had no intention of folding. Manstein's troops bled for every meter, and still the lines held. The Soviet Navy in the Black Sea wasn't just sitting pretty. Their guns barked from offshore, pounding German positions, covering their brothers in arms. Their fire was precise. Their timing was ruthless. They were the edge that kept Sevastopol breathing. Then came round 2, 17th of December. This time the Germans dug in and kept pushing for 2 punishing weeks. Blood and grit bought them progress, especially to the north and the east, where the Soviet lines began to buckle under the weight. But just as Manstein thought he had the upper hand, the Soviets punched back. A counteroffensive in late December forced him to lock down the city with 5 divisions. Sevastopol became a trap for everyone. Then came a Soviet move as bold as it was massive. 40,000 troops landing on the Kerch Peninsula. It was one of the biggest amphibious assaults the Red Army would pull off during the entire war. The tide wasn't just resisting, it was now surging. The Soviets hit hard and took Feodosia early, but what they found there made the victory taste like ash. Thousands of Jewish civilians dumped in mass graves outside the town. It wasn't just war anymore, it was evil, barefaced. With Soviet boots crashing onto the Kerch Peninsula and Feodosia under their control, Manstein suddenly found himself fighting on 2 fronts. He had no choice. He left a hardening holding force at Sevastopol and swung around to deal with the Soviet dagger aimed at his back. Those early 1942 gains gave Sevastopol a heartbeat again. The siege slackened, and for the first time in months, civilians crawled out of basements and caves. Like ghosts stepping into the daylight, they started repairing what little they could, but it didn't last. On the 8th of May, 1942, the Germans came roaring back. They hammered Soviet forces across the Kerch Peninsula, and the Luftwaffe owned the skies. Dive bombers screamed down like predators, turning Soviet trenches into craters and steel. And just when the Soviet defense needed brains, they got Commissar L.Z. Meklis, a political bulldozer with no understanding of the battlefield. His orders weren't just bad, they were disastrous. Thanks to Meklis's blunders, Soviet movements were sluggish, their resistance dull-edged. He stalled the withdrawal to Kerch's final defensive lines. By the 15th of May, the town was gone, taken right out from under him. In the chaos that followed, 86,000 Red Army troops managed to escape to the Taman Peninsula, but 176,000 were left behind, dead, dying, or captured. And every Soviet heavy gun was now in German hands. For Sevastopol, it was a nightmare made real. With the Crimean front in ruins, Manstein turned back to Sevastopol. He pulled in 5 more divisions, swelling the German assault force to over 200,000 men. And the hammer strike was ready. The firepower Manstein assembled was obscene. 420mm siege guns, 615mm mortars, and the monstrous 800mm railway cannons, giants of steel, built to obliterate cities. In total, 670 artillery pieces, almost as many anti-tank guns, and 600 aircraft to darken the skies. Sevastopol wasn't going to be stormed. It was going to be pulverized. Facing this avalanche, the Soviets had half the manpower. They scraped together 600 artillery pieces, just 38 tanks, and only 55 aircraft. It wasn't a fair fight, it was survival against overwhelming force. Sevastopol's lifeline was the sea, and the Germans knew it. They ringed the harbor with over 50 patrol boats and sub-hunters. In the skies above, 150 bombers hunted Soviet ships like prey. The noose was tightening horrifically. The Soviet Navy, depleted and outgunned, managed to slip through the blockade only with small craft and submarines. These were desperate supply runs, low and fast, dodging death at every turn. Yet somehow the city kept breathing. Even in the final month, 24,000 fresh troops made it in, and 25,000 sick and wounded were pulled out under fire. Sevastopol wasn't giving up, not yet. While shells rained from above, the Soviets carved their resistance deep into the earth. Beneath Sevastopol, hidden factories churned out mines, mortars, grenades, along with the uniforms and boots to keep soldiers in the fight. They even ran schools underground. The city wasn't just holding out, it was alive below ground, defying the death overhead. But when Kerch fell and German pressure surged, the bombardment became relentless. Supplies could barely move. Civilians who'd once made weapons now carried them. Every hand, young or old, turned toward the front line. Among Sevastopol's defenders, none were more fiercely remembered than the local Komsomol, young communists, boys and girls, side by side with the Red Army and the Marines. They didn't just support the fight, they were the fight. On the 2nd of June, the German guns opened up with a fury that hadn't yet been seen. 5 days later, the final offensive began. Soviet air defenses crumbled. Fighters were shot out of the sky or pulled back out of reach. The Luftwaffe had full control now, and the skies belonged to Nazi Germany. The German spear points slammed into the northeastern defenses, aiming to punch through Inkerman and the edge of North Bay. If they broke here, the city's spine would snap. But it wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. The Soviets fought like men with nothing left to lose. Every trench, every slope turned into a stand. After a week of grinding, bloody stalemate, even Manstein began to doubt. He called for backup. Occupation troops from Kerch, fresh blood from the north. This was going to take everything he had. Manstein's own losses were stacking up, but the Soviets were gasping. No fresh reserves. Only what could slip through the blockade, a trickle of men and bullets that couldn't keep up with the bleeding. By mid-June, both sides were hurting, but only one had anything left to give. By the 18th of June, German lead elements pushed up to North Bay. Soviet artillery, starved for shells, was forced to fire only at close range. Every round now counted. Every blast was a gamble. To the south, the Soviets fought like cornered animals, impossible to root out. But by the 30th of June, Manstein's two spearheads finally met near Inkerman. From there, the Germans pushed west with a unified front, and their jaws were closing. That night, German boots hit the very edge of Sevastopol. The evacuation began, not retreat, but escape. Anything that could move was put to use. Minesweepers, fishing boats, battered subs. Anything that floated became lifeboats. In the air, the last aircraft made suicide runs to broken landing strips under Luftwaffe fire. It was chaos. It was desperation. Only a handful got out. Most stayed behind, fighting until the end, or, if fate allowed, slipping into the mountains to fight again as ghosts among the hills. When German boots marched into Sevastopol on June the 30th, they ended a siege that had lasted 250 days. That's not a campaign. That's a crucible of willpower in war, a test of who could break the other first. The Russian stand was savage, and it bled both armies. The Germans claimed they bagged 90,000 prisoners out of a force of 106,000. Among them, 26,000 wounded were left lying in the sand, waiting for a rescue that just never came. The German 11th Army, by Soviet reckoning, was, quote, bled white, end quote. And they weren't exaggerating. Manstein won, but it cost him. It wasn't just the dead that hurt the Germans, it was the time, the manpower. So many divisions tied down in Sevastopol meant that the main push near Kharkov lost steam. The grand offensive toward the Caucasus delayed. The calendar slipped, and in war, that is a death sentence. By the time the Soviets came swinging back in late 1941 and again in 42, the 11th Army was still licking its wounds. Hitler couldn't use it. It was shattered, burnt out. It was stuck in recovery. The Soviets turned the loss into legend. Medals were minted. Survivors were honored. 37 of them named heroes of the Soviet Union. They'd lost the city, but not the story. Still, the medal couldn't change the map. The Germans had stripped the Soviets of their Black Sea stronghold and positioned themselves to launch into the Caucasus with naval muscle behind them. But the prize wasn't worth the price. Hitler fixated on Crimea, and in 1944 it came back to haunt him. He dumped far too many top-tier units into holding it, units he couldn't spare. Strategically, the peninsula mattered. Whoever held it controlled the Black Sea, and with it, striking distance to the oil fields of Romania. Fuel meant survival for the German war machine. But by May of '44, the war had shifted. American bombers were already hitting Romania from Italy, and Soviet forces were storming past Odessa. Crimea wasn't the linchpin anymore, it was a liability. When the Red Army came back, they didn't crawl, they stormed. What had taken the Germans months, the Soviets reclaimed in weeks. This time, half the defenders were Romanian. They lasted a month, and then they broke. The Soviet assault kicked off on the 11th of April, and in just 48 hours, the northern half of Crimea was theirs. No slow siege, just raw power. The Axis had about 174,000 men in place. The Soviets came at them with nearly 3 times that. The math wrote its own ending. As the Wehrmacht retreated towards Sevastopol, Romanian forces threw down their arms. Their fight was collapsing from within. Around 50,000 German troops burrowed into 25 miles of trenches, bracing for the storm they knew was coming. The Red Army didn't charge, they paused. They brought in the big guns. Sevastopol wasn't going to fall fast, it was going to fall hard. Those 3 weeks were a gift the Germans used to the last second, fortifying, delaying, and pulling out what men they could before this hammer dropped. What Hitler dreamed would be a glorious last stand morphed into a chaotic, desperate echo of Dunkirk. Except here, there was no miracle and no glory. The numbers, they're murky. Soviet and German records clash. Some fled, many didn't. The truth's buried somewhere under the rubble. The last fight for Sevastopol didn't drag on. It didn't echo the long agony of the siege that came before. When the Red Army returned in 1944, they tore through the city in just 4 brutal, violent, thunderous days. By May 9th, it was over. Sevastopol had fallen again, but this time, it wasn't ripped from Soviet hands. This time, it was taken back. And still, it's the first fall that haunts the soul. 250 days. That's how long the defenders held. Men and women, soldiers and school teachers, engineers working in caverns, children learning to read between the air raids. For 250 days, they fought not just for a city, but for the very idea that it could survive the unstoppable. The siege didn't just break bones, it built myth. And in the hearts of millions, Sevastopol became sacred ground. It is remembered with tears, with pride, and with silence. And as the dust settled, as the smoke curled off shattered stone, and the guns finally fell quiet, the world bore witness to what a people can endure when the fire inside refuses to go out. Sevastopol did not surrender. It was carved into legend. Thanks for listening. Let's now descend into the killing fields of the comment section. On our episode on the Battle of Atlanta and the March to the Sea, Season 1, Episode 36, a listener by the name of user 194679346 wrote, "Convenient. God completely forgot to address the fact that the North purchased slave-picked cotton, sold slaves to southern states, and lynched black people over military integration." Absolutely. A vital point you're raising and one that deserves serious attention by all. You're right to highlight that the North's hands were not clean. Northern textile mills thrived on slave-picked cotton in many northern banks, and corporate shipping interests profited directly from the slave economy. Even as slavery was abolished in their own states, many in the North were complicit in perpetuating the system by reaping its economic rewards. The selling of enslaved people in the Deep South from the Upper South, often via northern intermediaries, and the racism that persisted long after slavery's formal end, including violent resistance to black military integration. These are shameful chapters in American history, and these truths must be reckoned with honestly. That said, though, it's also important to recognize complexity without flattening the historical landscape. While the North was complicit in many injustices, it was also where the abolitionist movement gained traction, where thousands of black and white citizens risked and gave their lives to destroy slavery, and where the Union ultimately waged war that culminated in emancipation. Imperfect actors can still do consequential, morally significant things. Acknowledging Northern hypocrisy doesn't diminish the importance of the Union's role in ending slavery. It deepens our understanding of the war as not a simple moral tale, but a brutally, ruthlessly complicated conflict in which justice emerged, perhaps not fully for either side, but it emerged not from purity, but from struggle. Thanks for listening. See you guys tomorrow.